So good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Julia Budnik, and I'm one of the directors of SDS Seminars, together with Professor Paul Grantham. And I'm very, very glad to welcome you tonight to our traditional now SDS Thursdays. And we are rolling well into the second year. And it's very interesting because we actually, with slight relaxation, or actually full relaxation of pandemic rules, we were wondering whether to continue. And we had a long discussion, Paul and I, about continuing or not continuing with SDS Thursdays. And we've decided to stick with them. Firstly, because we do feel that it's quite a while before we can come back to in-the-room training. And probably even if we do, we will still continue in-the-room training with some form of online training as well, because people realize that spending enormous amount of money on traveling down to London for training is just not practical. So maybe lots of you will continue doing training online. And this Thursday enable us to have some sort of sense of community, because as I said in the beginning, seeing familiar faces and even familiar names when you were logging in was incredibly pleasant and really quite reassuring. So we wanted to continue for that reason. The second reason is because we know that lots of people are joining us from all over the place, and some of them are not able to come to our training events. So we always ask our tutors who present at these Thursdays to make their presentation practical. So even though it is short, you get something out of it and you can treat it as a separate training event. So we feel that it's still very useful for people who can't come to longer trainings for whatever reason, maybe from far away in the world, or for time constraints or financial constraints. Another thing is that we found that it's a very good tool to introduce new topics to you. And we do offer you enormous amount of new topics, particularly in this quarter of the year, September, October, November, we'll be offering enormous amount of new topics. And that's why actually in September, Thursdays will be weekly, like we used to have them weekly. So because there's so much to introduce to you. And before I pass the microphone to Paul, because I know that we still have a bit of time of catching up with people joining, I wanted to actually take you through our calendar for September and October. I know that Paul has written you a very long email about our plans for this academic year. And I'm pretty sure that maybe not all of you read it until the end, because it was a long email. So I very briefly take you through the courses which we're offering and hope that you might find something useful for yourself. So I'll share the screen and you just let me know, Paul, please, that actually I think it should work. Yep. Thumbs up, you can see it. Fantastic. So you are familiar with SDS website, as I'm sure, because we are writing to you regularly, and you probably have been on our website more than once. So in order to see what courses are coming up, you click on the link up here called All Courses. So that's a menu tab, All Courses. And then you can choose what is called Calendar View. Okay, so you click on the calendar view and then you can see all our courses in calendar order as a list. So as I said, we've started today with Tony Atwood and Michelle Garnett on autism, but on the 9th of September, we are starting a brand new BPS approved certificate in integrated CBT for working with adolescents. Lots of people came to me with the question, how is it different to our certificate in CBT for children and adolescents, it is very different, because certificates in CBT for children and adolescents mainly focuses on mental health issues, diagnostic mental health issues, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, issues like that. When we're talking about certificates in CBT for adolescents, we are focusing on specific issues relative to teenagers and adolescents. So issues of computer gaming, issues of socializing, sexual issues, issues of using drugs, and all sorts of issues which are relevant to that specific age group, which are not necessarily fitting diagnostic categories. So it's a very different certificate. We are offering it as 2 hours lunchtime bite-sized lectures once a month. So it's very manageable, and obviously, because the modules are short, the price is considerably lower than many of our other trainings. So we're starting on the 9th of September with managing difficult emotions and emotional regulation in adolescents. So still have time to join us if you want. And you can book these modules 5 for the price of 4. So if you choose 5 topics which you like, you can book them for the price of 4, or you can book the whole certificate or individual modules. So that's what is coming on the 9th of September. On the 21st, 23rd of September, we're running CBT introductory course, which is incredibly popular, and you can see it is already fully booked. And furthermore, I can tell you that the one in November is also already fully booked. So if you want to join us for that particular certificate course, you will need to book yourself on a February course. So the earliest for CBT introductory course is February. And on the 24th of September, Paul will be presenting a module in our other new certificate, BPS approved certificate in working with non-diagnostic categories or common life challenges. And he will be presenting a 2-hour event, a 2-hour lunchtime bite-size lecture on perfectionism. And tonight you will get a taster of that particular event. So tonight's topic is working with perfectionism. Paul will introduce the topic to you, will give you some practical pointers, and hopefully will encourage you to want more and to come to a longer event on the 24th of September. I feel that probably I've spoken too long, so for now I'll stop sharing and very happily pass the microphone to Paul.
Hi folks, good to see you all again. Feels like it's been a long time over the summer, but it's good to see familiar faces, and it's good to see folks who I don't recognize. Maybe that's my memory rather than the fact you've not been here before, but it's good to see you all anyway. So I wanted to just take you through and give you something of a flavor of the slightly longer training event that Julia's just mentioned to you. So if you just give me a moment and I will share my screen. Which you will hopefully be able to see. Can I just say something before I start on this, because it's something that's not been mentioned before. I mean, Julia's mentioned that we have this this new BPS approved certificate on integrated CBT for common life challenges. If I can just say a little bit about that and why we put it together, just to give you a setting really for this. I think the first thing to say is that although there are really understandable reasons why so much training that's around now and thinking that is around within the mental health field is dominated and categorized by diagnosis. It does strike me that there's a whole range of problems that people experience, and which they either need help for or seek help for, which don't naturally and easily fit into specific diagnoses, really. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to put something together on what we've called common life challenges. And as you know, there's two of these that have already gone. One's on self-esteem, one's on imposter syndrome. They are actually available as recordings if you want to access them, if you're interested in them, and they do count towards the overall certificate, by the way. For those of you that are particularly interested in imposter syndrome, we also have a longer term 2-day course which will take you through a whole program that I've developed that I think is occurring in November, if my memory serves me right. But again, you can book in online with that. The other thing I just wanted to highlight with this was this term integrated CBT. It strikes me that we are increasingly arriving at a position of seeing CBT now as a much broader and also integrated set of different ideas, strategies, techniques, which actually come from a wide variety of traditions, and also in many ways, I think, draw on different approaches and methods of actually helping people to overcome their problems. And that's certainly going to be something that we are probably going to be concentrating a lot more on in the future, and which is also something which is going to be running through the certificate for adolescents that Julia mentioned. But we've got this third module that's coming up on perfectionism using an integrated CBT approach. And as I said, this evening, I just really wanted to sort of introduce you to it, to get you thinking about it, to give you some sort of practical ideas about how to actually help your clients with this. And I hope, obviously, to stimulate your interest in terms of signing up for the full 2-hour event that's running in a couple of weeks' time. So I thought it was worth just starting off with looking at what this actually is and what it actually looks like. And I wanted us to do that because I do think that for some people, there is some degree of confusion about what perfectionism actually is, and whether actually it's a problem or not. So I wanted to run through a number of characteristics on that, just to sort of touch base on it and get some clarity on it. I think in the vast majority of instances, it's about the establishment of unrealistically high standards. And I use the term unrealistically high here, by which I mean standards which actually cannot be reached. And I think that you know, that idea of setting standards that are just out of reach for the individual is probably its most common presentation. I think that there are some clients with perfectionism problems that I've worked with who would actually say that's not true. My standards are actually quite realistic, and indeed I frequently meet them. So I think that for some folks, it's not so much about the fact that the standards are unrealistically high, it's more about the price that they are paying in order to reach those particular standards, and the price in distress, in terms of emotional mood, and so on, and time very often, incidentally, and so on and so forth. So it's just worth, I think, when you're thinking about this, to have both of those potential aspects of the definition in mind. Secondly, and I think this is a really a sort of quite a central idea which differentiates perfectionism from what might be broadly termed healthy striving, is that the individual's whole sense of self-worth is dependent on success. So it is not, you know, success is not seen as one particular element or characteristic of who I actually am. It becomes the defining characteristic by which I make a judgment about whether I actually have any worth or not. And that tends to mean that there's a great degree of emphasis on achievement and doing. Now, there's this Albert Ellis term here of masturbation, which many of you will probably be familiar with, but I think it's one of those things or one of those terms which actually has got good applicability here, because, and we'll come on to this in a moment, but the idea of I must do this, I must achieve such and such is absolutely central to perfectionism. For some folks, this is not about behavior. And it's actually more about looks, and we're going to come back to that in a minute, because it tends to lead to or be involved with slightly different problems, but it's still a perfectionism issue. There's also a very interesting issue that crops up, and again, what I find quite interesting about the search for certainty is that, like a number of other issues that we are looking at within this particular certificate, this is both potentially cross-diagnostic and appears to coexist with a number of the other issues that we're dealing with. So, the search for certainty, or more accurately in some ways, difficulties tolerating uncertainty, is something that crops up with imposter syndrome. It's something that crops up clearly, obviously, here with perfectionism. It crops up in some instances as well with procrastination. In other words, it's one of those issues that sort of runs in parallel with these other common concerns. In this particular context, with regards to perfectionism, the key question is how do I know if it's enough? How do I know whether what I've done is good enough? How do I know, if we're looking at looks, the way I appear is good enough? And because there's no sense of certainty for many people in this, it not surprisingly drives the engine forward of saying I must do more in some particular way. All of this, as you probably guessed already, is strongly associated with very highly critical self-evaluation. So there's an idea, I guess, that many of you will know within social anxiety, of the idea of individuals seeing themselves as a social object. What we have here is the individual, again, seeing themselves as an object, but as an object that is to be continuously judged in some way. I am somebody who is always under review and always being evaluated, and it's being done in a very, very critical way. In other words, it's not an evaluation which really identifies success and failure. It's an evaluation which is only interested in shortcoming. Now, not surprisingly, this ties in with our old friend, selective attention. So you'll probably can immediately see here that folks who tend to be perfectionistic selectively attend to any evidence at all of failure, any evidence at all of less than perfection, any evidence at all of rejection as well, rather than, for instance, selectively attending to the things that have gone well, or the things that I'm good at, or the acceptance of what it is I actually have as an individual. So all of this, I hope you can see, and I think this is probably to sort of summarize the key elements of this. All of this is terribly self-defeating, in the sense that there's always that idea that either I'm not doing enough and I've got to do more. So I never arrive anywhere. There's always something more. Or alternatively, even if I do reach that target that I'm repeatedly setting myself, the personal price that I am paying in this is just enormously high. And it's that where I would want to make a distinction between perfectionism and healthy striving. You know, there's no suggestion that it is a bad thing to strive. You know, the whole idea of self-actualization and fulfilling your true potential, I think, is a sort of a partner with striving, but that's radically different from having either ever-changing criteria for what success actually is, or alternatively feeling totally driven and defined by whether I actually reach these particular standards. And that, folks, is I think probably the single most important thing, which makes this a problem which people actually need help with. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that perfectionism is one of those particular problems that sort of overlaps or feeds in to other issues. And I think when I was thinking through this, I was actually really struck by the fact that it probably crops up in a much larger number of problems than you would first think. And I think this is important to recognize, because not everybody that you and I will be working with will actually come along and necessarily say, I have a problem with perfectionism. They may well come along with another problem. And that's why I think, and yet, sorry, I should make this clear, and yet in order to help them work with this other problem, you are probably going to need to look at some of their perfectionism as well. So let's start off with looking at the sort of three areas where this can crop up. The first one, which is what is called self-oriented perfectionism. And it's the one, to be honest with you, because of the time that we've got when we come on to the event later on this month, it's the one that we're going to be solely concentrating on, which is all to do with the idea that I'm not good enough. So it's perfectionism as it applies to the individual themselves. Now, there are some other types of perfectionism, which are issues, and I do want to emphasize here that these are not mutually exclusive. And indeed, you will often find that this idea that I'm not good enough, in many instances, ends up applying itself to other contexts as well. So the second one is they're not good enough. In other words, other people aren't good enough. Other people aren't doing what they should be doing. Other people aren't fulfilling the best of what they could do, and so on and so forth. And then the final one is, to some degree, an overlap between these two, which is other people don't think I'm good enough. And you can obviously see here how this can shade into both paranoia. You can see how this can shade into things like social anxiety as well. But I do want to emphasize, within the sort of time we've got, and what I'm going to be certainly looking at today, and when we're looking at this in more detail later on this month, I'm going to be really almost exclusively focusing on self-oriented perfectionism. Now, I said that this overlaps and plays a key role with a number of problems. And this, to be honest with you, was a slightly sort of random selection that sort of came to mind when I was sort of putting this together. So they're not in any particular order, but I hope you can see that individuals may not present to you with problems of perfectionism, at least not overtly, but they might present to you with one or more of these other issues where perfectionism feeds into it or is a causal factor. So high levels of self-criticism, lots of over-checking. You know, over-checking is a very common behavior when you're dealing with anything that relates to difficulties with uncertainty. And certainly, not surprisingly, with perfectionism, knowing whether it's good enough feeds into that sort of over-checking behavior. Task time consumption. I hope this is self-evident, but by definition, if you are perfectionist, then it's going to mean that you are not going to be brief on the way in which you approach tasks. And you might say, well, is that a real issue? And the brief answer is it really depends on what you're taking time away from. Time, to state an obvious point here, is finite. And for that particular reason, I've certainly worked with people who are perfectionistic, and where actually the prompt for them seeking help is the lack of time, for example, that they're spending with their family because of the degree to which their time is taken up with other things. Social isolation, again, very commonly associated with task time consumption. If you want to get things exactly right, then you haven't got time for other people. And certainly there are a number of instances where perfectionists become very socially isolated. If perfectionism relates, for example, to looks, then I hope you can see again as well, there's going to be a high level of sensitivity with regards to spending time with other people. Lots of performance anxieties. Perfectionism, you know, certainly if you look at teenagers and look at university students, often comes through as a real issue with performance anxiety with regards to handing in assignments and completing exams. A narrowing of interests. Again, I know this is an obvious point to state, but I think it's really important. Time is finite. So if you are going to be spending a lot of time trying to get things exactly right, you haven't got a lot of time for anything else. So you become rather obsessive regarding the particular things that you are actually spending your time on. And that obviously has some knock-on interests as well with regards to social interaction and so on and so forth. We know now from the research that there is a big causal role for perfectionism regarding dropout from university and also unemployment and having no job as well. I probably don't see many folks where unemployment is an issue, but I've certainly seen a number of folks where it has played a key role in dropping out of the educational system in some particular way. Because to make an obvious point here, you know, if I'm perfectionistic in terms of the way in which I approach educational assignments, I'm often late, I don't get them completed, and after a period of time that you know, I get thrown out, or alternatively, I can't stand the pressure of having to do these things within the time constraints that are given. So not surprisingly, this also, and we come full circle here, leads to broad problems very often with procrastination. Most common one, can I say, with procrastination, as it overlaps with perfectionism, is non-completion of tasks. But for some people, it also creates difficulties in terms of actually starting them in the first place, and also delays in the middle, or repeated delays in the middle with these. So there's a lot of sort of non-diagnostic, non-clinical, but distressing life problems that people experience, which have as a sort of driving course the whole issue of perfectionism. We also have a range of clinical problems as well, where these actually play a role. And I'll sort of, don't know quite why I've got body dysmorphic disorder up there twice, but anyway. But if we take those first two of eating disorders, particularly anorexia and body dysmorphic disorder, you can obviously see how the whole issue of perfectionism regarding looks is quite central. And with regards to eating, perfectionism with regards to behavioral consumption of food or otherwise. It plays a role with generalized anxiety disorder, and the sort of gateway there from perfectionism into GAD, or generalized anxiety disorder, or what is commonly known as chronic worrying, is again very often this issue about the search for certainty, of wanting to definitely know something is so, or no, it's not so, and you know, what you have to do in order to do that. And also you know, perfectionism in terms of whether I'm actually doing enough to try and minimize the perceived risks. We've already mentioned the relationship between perfectionism and social anxiety. there's a really interesting area, which I can only very briefly touch on, about the relationship between perfectionism and poor physical pain management. I should broaden this out, can I say, and say that it has applicability, I think, for a wide variety of physical health problems, which are about the experience and management of internal sensations. Physical pain is the most obvious example of this, but the idea that I should be totally pain-free, I should be in a position where I can do everything that I want to do, and so on and so forth, and that I should be able to do it without any sensation, often means, very interestingly enough, that some of the people who present with some of the most disabling physical pain often are also perfectionist in terms of their approach to it. I hope you understand here, I'm not talking about the physical substrate of pain, which is unchangeable, but the experience of pain is very determined by psychological factors, of which perfectionism is a key one. We know that perfectionism plays a key role in hoarding behavior. I don't know how many of you actually deal with this. I'm always interested to know how much of it is an issue that folks have to deal with. But again, I hope you can see here how this fits, and it also fits as well with the idea of difficulties tolerating uncertainty. How do I know that I will not need this thing in the future? I need to make sure that everything I might need in the future is actually available to me, and so on and so forth. And for that particular reason, I must make sure that ... Not surprisingly, perfectionism feeds into depression. That's probably not going to be a surprise to you if you are judging yourself on the basis of what it is that you can actually achieve, and you perceive yourself as not doing that. That's clearly going to have a big impact for many people in terms of creating low mood. And finally, obsessional compulsive disorder problems. Again, the desire for exactitude, precision, and again, the search for certainty, which often feels frequently absent when people have got OCD problems. Now, what sorts of things do we know make a difference to whether someone actually has a tendency to be perfectionistic? And there's sort of two things that I'm going to try and draw your broad attention to at the moment. One has to do with the style of thinking, and the other one has to do with the content of thinking. Both of them are maintenance factors, classic CBT approach to focus primarily on maintenance factors here. But let me just run through these. I'm probably, for a number of you that have trained with me before, you will know that I'm generally speaking not a massive fan of the value of thinking styles in terms of approaching problems. I actually think this is an exception to the rule. And actually, I think the style of thinking with perfectionism is actually in many ways more important than the content. In a way, if the content, if the style of thinking wasn't a problem, I think the content in many instances would just be about healthy striving. But it's the style of thinking which creates the difficulty. So, top of the list, all or nothing thinking, rigidity of thinking, lots of musts and shoulds, and also a high level of catastrophizing as well. The prediction of horrific disaster should a rule actually be broken. And I've actually got a case example here just to illustrate this briefly for you. This is Kerry, a 22-year-old young woman who's referred to me, referred at the time with what was described as finals exam stress. She also was presenting with some sort of subclinical OCD symptoms, poor sleep and low mood. But the sort of common gateway, I think, that was running through all of this was her perfectionism. And I just got to hear a selection really of sort of quotations from things that she actually said, which just give you a flavor of how these illustrate the problems with thinking style that I've just mentioned. Unless I get a first, the whole of the rest of my life is crap. I hope you can see the sort of rigidity, all or nothingness there. I really should get the best results in my year. If I want to get into law school, it's a must. Great example. I remember thinking this at the time. It was a great example of musts and shoulds. And then we've got this wonderful illustration of catastrophic thinking, which is if I get a 2, 2 or a third, it's a disaster. Something incidentally she was highly unlikely to get, but she says it's going to be a disaster. It'll be a massive debt and a fucked up life. So it just, I hope, briefly illustrates the sort of issue that's around with regards to the problem with thinking style. There's nothing fundamentally wrong, in my opinion, with the aspiration that she had. The primary problem lay with the rigidity of the thinking, the catastrophizing, and the use of musts and shoulds that were there all the time. Having said this, there are also some types of belief which play a key role in terms of keeping perfectionism going. We've got clear beliefs about standards, and these are, can I just say, these are the things that you need to be looking out for as a therapist, which will either be voiced directly by your client, or alternatively, you will be able to elicit with gentle probing. So X is a sign of success. Getting a first is a sign of success, for example. Rigidity of beliefs, which is the thing I've been trying to emphasize, which is, I think, the most important thing, which is X is the only sign of success. This brings us back again to the individual defining their self-worth in terms of achievement and having a very, very narrow criteria for that achievement. And then compulsion of beliefs, I must do X. And then the meaning of success, I'm only of value if I do X. Now, when we come to the longer training that we're going to be doing towards the end of this month, we're going to be looking in a lot more detail at the sorts of strategies that we're going to be using. But I just wanted to give you a very brief flavor of the broad approach that I actually took with Kerry when I was actually working with her. And again, you can see some of the examples of the types of thinking that she had been presenting with. So when you're going to be working with folks, there's going to be two elements that you're going to need to address. One is you're going to need to be addressing key maintenance behaviors: procrastination, excessive organizing and overchecking. By the way, perfectionists, a bit like procrastinators, tend to often be massive list makers. Lots of avoidance behavior, repeated correcting, which is slightly different from checking. I've mentioned list making already, and high levels of indecisiveness and slowness of response, to take things carefully and slowly. So when I actually worked with Kerry, my initial focus with her was that we needed to look not so much at the content of what it was that she believed, but instead to actually look at the issue of certainty. Now, for me, this is sort of, I'm a great believer in that CBT idea that you should largely go for, you work from the outside in, you go for the low-hanging fruit first of all, because basically it's easier to create change there, which then creates confidence in the client. And in addition to that, in many instances, will often give both you and the client a good pointer to know whether or not you've got to go further or not. So being the case, our primary therapeutic goal was to create cognitive doubt, because my aim really with Kerry was not to substantially get her to question the content of her beliefs regarding perfectionism. I was more concerned about the strength of belief that was attached to them and the rigidity of her thinking. So the aim was to move her to more healthy striving. Not that you should always, sorry, that she should move herself to, you should always do your best rather than you must do your best, which is the more rigid form. We conducted a number of behavioral experiments to test out predictions of catastrophe. One of the key ones that was around for her was that being perfectionist is crucial for me in getting the best results possible. In fact, if I'm not going to be a perfectionist, then actually I'm not going to get the best results. So that actually became quite a central feature of behavioral experiment that we conducted. I'll be taking you through the details of that and other behavioral experiments when we actually look at things later on in the month. I wanted to alter her selective attention. This is another sort of low-hanging fruit issue, I think. You know, in a sense, the key issue here is about helping clients to attend to successes, not just failures. So there's some fairly simple ways in which we could actually do that. And also I wanted to get her to review the value that she attached to failure and how she actually defined it. So I wanted to help her to identify how examples of past success were less than 100% perfect, i.e. good enough, and also identify how successes only actually occur through errors. So in a way, progress and becoming even better, which is part of healthy striving, at the end of the day only actually comes through making mistakes. And it's through learning from those that you can actually improve. I also obviously wanted to do some work with her, increasing her tolerance of uncertainty. This, generally speaking, in my experience, tends to be a much broader and more robust and resistance to change issue. So it's why it comes along later on in the therapy process, simply because I'm hoping, and in fact, it was substantially successful with Kerry, but I was actually hoping that we would not need to invest a lot of time in this in order to produce a change which was valuable to her. And finally, we also did some cognitive diffusion work. I don't know, again, how many of you are familiar with third wave techniques, but rather than altering the content or even the thinking style that you actually have, cognitive diffusion techniques are much more about altering the relationship that you actually have with your beliefs. And by altering your relationship, and in some ways distancing yourself and recognizing the existence but disowning to some degree those particular beliefs, it again contributes to creating a healthy striving rather than perfectionism. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a flavor of what we're going to be looking at in a lot more detail later on this week. So I will end my share. I don't know how much time we've got, Julia, and whether we can take questions at all.
Yes, I have a question myself, so we certainly can take that one.
Right.
Anyway, I wanted to clarify one thing, Paul, please, because I dare say probably 50% of people in this group might identify themselves as perfectionists. I think probably the number is this high, if not higher. So where the perfectionism, and they don't see any problem with that. As Sue mentioned in her comment before, I'm a perfectionist and I don't see it as an issue. So at what stage and how do we decide whether we need to address the issue of perfectionism as something we need to address therapeutically, and at what stage we just accept it as a personality trait?
Okay. I don't think this is fundamentally any different from any other problem. All of us are anxious. that doesn't mean to say we need help with anxiety. So, the two things I think which are most important here in terms of whether it needs to be addressed is, number one, the degree of distress it creates. And that's a sliding scale, and what it is, what level of distress leads one person to seek help rather than another is obviously variable. But I think that basically, if this is something which dictates your mood, if it's something which determines in a negative way how you feel about yourself, then it's worth getting to grips with. The other thing, of course, is the thing that I mentioned earlier, which is effect on behavior. Time is finite. Shame we can't spend a whole training event on the whole psychology of time, but there is a tendency to not recognize that time is finite. And for that particular reason, because perfectionistic people tend to get or spend more time involved in particular tasks, by definition, it means they are not able to spend time on other things. Now, I think this is tricky to make a judgment about if you are the only one that's there to assess, really. What very often happens for a lot of perfectionistic people is that they decide they've got a problem because they've got a reaction from other people. So there will be people, for instance, who will, I don't know, lose a partner or lose a boyfriend or a girlfriend because basically they never see them because they're spending all of their time on X and trying to get it exactly right. There are other instances where people will say, you are just very boring and I don't want to spend as much time with you, thanks very much, because all you ever can think about is such and such and so and so. But I think that the effect on behavior is, I think that's a reason to seek help. But I think what I'm saying is it's not as visible as the effect it has on mood. So for most people, I think, if you are in that position, and saying I'm a bit perfectionistic myself, is that really a problem? The brief answer is that it depends on its effect on you, and it depends on its effect on other people.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting. Irina mentions that she works with a lot of high performance ballet dancers, musicians, and says that she recognizes lots of aspects which you've mentioned. So that's great. There was a little bit of lack of clarity about the relationship between pain perception and perfectionism. So just if you quickly go through it again, but quickly, because we really need to finish.
Okay. So one of the things that when people have let's take arthritis as an example, where there's a clear physical substrate to the pain. That pain is objectively there, but the person's experience of the pain actually varies, and people can have the same arthritic problem medically, but first of all, their experience of that pain varies, and secondly, the degree to which it interferes with what they do in their daily life also varies considerably, and that is determined by their relationship with their pain. So there's a big psychological element in that. Part of it, to give you a very simple illustration of this, we can't really get into it in detail, but the whole principle of using distraction as a way of coping with pain, for example, is something which people are familiar with. They know that it's easier on occasions to live with physical discomfort if you can distract yourself. Okay. But the key thing to bear in mind is that whatever you are doing psychologically to help you experience or manage that pain is not perfect. In other words, it doesn't make you pain-free. The issue for a lot of people who are perfectionistic, and why they are often poorer pain managers, is because they use exceptionally high, unachievable standards regarding what they should be experiencing internally with regards to pain, and how well the treatment actually is achieving that.
It's all or nothing thinking, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
If I have a bit of pain, it's the same as I have pain.
Yes, yeah, I've still got the pain.
Yeah.
I've still got the pain, you know, and the fact that, you know, I've got an awareness of pain, for me, it's just as bad as if I couldn't get out of bed this morning, because I've still got the pain. Yeah. And I hope you can see how that sort of fits into a perfectionist attitude.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have an example with COVID, with a perfectionist who says, I won't leave my house until everything will be completely back to normal. So for how long? But that's again, all or nothing thinking, you know. I will not do it until everyone without masks and things like that. Guys, we can't really go for any more questions, but I hope that if you want to continue talking about this topic, you will come on the 24th. It's only a 2 hours presentation, but we will be able to cover much more, and hopefully Paul will be able to answer the question why people usually say I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I've never heard anybody saying I'm a huge perfectionist. So that's a very interesting question as well. And very quickly to let you know that next week we're meeting on the 9th, as always on Thursday, and that will be another presentation by Paul on procrastination. And you will see actually how these two topics link perfectly together, and why perfectionists, which is counterintuitive, very often procrastinate. And the last thing I was asked, how to get imposter syndrome and self-esteem recordings. If you want to watch Thursdays, which are free on imposter syndrome and on self-esteem, they are available on our website, and they are available on our YouTube channel, to which you can subscribe. If you want to watch the full 2-hour course recording, you need to book the course just normal way, and you can watch them as a recording and do the test at the end and receive your certificate. I think it was a lovely start of the academic year. Paul, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. As always, guys, you can unmute yourself and say goodbye. And we really hope to see you next week so we can continue this discussion. Bye now.
Take care, folks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Brilliant.
Bye.